Very cool. So today we're going to go over LiDAR data products. So it's not going to be like this exhaustive overview of LiDAR data and kind of the physics behind that, because that's kind of, I'd say, outside the scope of applied um, remote sensing, at least in this kind of session today. I'm really trying to give you some exposure to LiDAR and manipulating that data and maybe pique your interest and see if you want to pursue it either as a hobby or maybe for your project, or see how that could help you with your career long term. But we're going to be looking at LiDAR data products generally, and then kind of narrowing in onto Canopy height models. And so that will make a little more sense in a few minutes, but it's kind of a more ecological application of LiDAR data. But as you'll see shortly, there are many kind of non plant based uses as well. And so today we're going to have an overview of LiDAR data products. Then we'll kind of focus in on Canopy height models and then just jump right over to the Lab 3 demonstration. I don't want to spend too much time lecturing at you because that's pretty boring, I think, for everyone. I think it's useful to get some context, but then to just jump right in and start learning and tinkering and exploring. And so if you ever want longer lectures, let me know. But I think that in general, a slightly shorter lecture with more time to learn on your own and collaborate is probably what people generally want. But yeah, let's get right into it. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to either write it in the chat or unmute yourself and just interject. This is a pretty laid back group. We're all kind of we're learning, or we're getting to know each other more and more. So just yeah, if you have a question, just ask. So previously, we've been looking at more, I guess, two-dimensional raster data. So both with the normalized burn ratio and the NDVI, and even with the multispectral imagery we've been looking at, it's all kind of two-dimensional slices, kind of like a sheet of paper. And so there's no real necessarily information about elevation or kind of like distance of the size of objects. There's ways you can kind of interpolate or predict what the size might be without structure data, but using something like LiDAR really gives you a powerful insight that you couldn't otherwise have with more traditional two-dimensional remote sensing methods. And then kind of on the flip side, you see these two researchers or foresters in the field on this image measuring diameter of this or the circumference of this large tree and trying to get an estimate of biomass. And you can see how that's a pretty time consuming and a potentially dangerous job, and how if you have more than one or two trees, this might not be that feasible. And so using some sort of remote sensing technology to get information about tree biomass would be super powerful. And this is where something like LiDAR comes into play, because it's this kind of perfect complement to both on the ground measurements with like rulers and like measuring tape, and then also like more traditional remote sensing spectral imagery like NDVI. And so LiDAR is short for light detection and ranging, and it's a method that uses light in the form of pulsed lasers to measure variable distances to Earth. And so you can think about it's an active remote sensing system. Instead of just passively collecting light data reflected off the Earth, it's actually emitting light and then kind of calculating distances based on how long it takes for the light to reflect. And so these sensors are flying above us. They can be on either UAV, an airplane, or even a satellite. And they have these, I guess, positional sensors that complement these spectral lasers. And so you're able to get a very precise, depending on the scale or the coarseness of the laser pulses, image of the structure of the Earth. And so Um, NOAA uses this pretty extensively to characterize coastlines and even underwater areas. Um, so I guess here's some applications. One pretty common one is forestry, and so using LiDAR to characterize kind of forest ecosystem structure, and even like non-forested landscapes, like more shrubbed landscapes, or even in the context of agriculture, using LiDAR in like vineyards to get really precise, or even in just almond orchards, just precise information about the harvest. Um, Outside of plant, and besides those kind of more, I guess, capitalist indicators for plants, you can also look at stuff like leaf area index, species identification. If you know that there's a very specific species phenotype in a landscape, you can kind of focus in on that using LiDAR if it has a very certain shape compared to all other plants. Outside the plant realm, you can really use LiDAR to generate super high resolution elevation data. I think this is the most OG use case, to be honest, and it's still probably the bread and butter of LiDAR, but increasingly there's alternative applications. Another one that kind of builds off of elevation data is kind of geologic hazard mapping. It's kind of when the elevation is perhaps nebulous or changing, or hazardous for people. And so you can think of events like landslides and active seismic faults as being potentially mappable things with 3D structure, even like flood risk. If you know certain areas are below sea level, you're able to kind of predict more at-risk regions when there's a flood event. In more urban contexts, kind of building off of these hazards, you also see LiDAR used to just inventory what's there. So getting a catalog of buildings, bridges, utility networks. LiDAR is a really helpful way to complement just like the 2D imagery data, because there's a lot of assets in the real world that it kind of matters the state that they are in, and it's like if they're functioning or not, and it's hard to tell sometimes from a 2D static image. And so something like a three-dimensional LiDAR complement can really help that. Another thing used kind of outside of pure like urban regional planning, but kind of ancillary to that, is cultural resource management. And so this is one that Holden recommended from our class, so that was super cool, and thanks for that. But mound detection, so kind of indigenous mounds are hidden underneath forested landscapes often, like mangrove forests, and you're able to use LiDAR to kind of see through the forested cover and detect where these previously hidden mounds were. So that's another cool application of LiDAR. So now that we've kind of discussed where LiDAR fits in the mix of data collection, kind of the applications where LiDAR is being used, I think it's important to at least briefly discuss some of the technical, at least at a high level, of what's going on with LiDAR. So LiDAR is a system that measures the time it takes for emitted light to travel to the ground and back. And that time is used to calculate distance traveled. So distance traveled is then converted to elevation. And so hopefully this doesn't give you too many flashbacks to like painful high school, but you know how you can kind of translate light to distance because light travels at the speed of light. And so there's some physics and some math you can do to really reverse calculate how tall things are, which is super cool. And so that's at a very kind of generalized level. And then this kind of energy that's returned. And so remember, the LiDAR sensor is emitting energy. So it's like a pulse of lasers shooting down, and then the Earth is reflecting that energy, and it's returning to the sensor, and it's returning in this thing called a waveform. And so different types of LiDAR sensors kind of measure this differently, but generally speaking, light is returning back in a wave. And so the LiDAR sensor is measuring the intensity of this light, and kind of in different areas or through time. And so you can kind of reverse engineer the structure of plants based on how the light is wiggling and wobbling through time, because that's kind of indicative of there was something that the light hit and made it kind of wiggle a little more. And so those are very like layman's terms, but really kind of what's happening. Like the scientists and the researchers are measuring these kind of wobbles and wiggles in the line, and they're able to reverse engineer the structure of trees or buildings based on where the wiggles and wobbles are, which that's kind of insane and cool if you think about it. And so places where there's more photons or more light energy return a stronger or larger sensor peak in the distribution of energy. So that would be something like this. And so something that's reflecting more of this lighter energy will create a larger kind of peak in the waveform. And so that would be something like a branch or a building. And so you can see here in this illustration, there's these kind of smaller or maybe intermediate peaks as we're going through time. And so you can imagine time is kind of analogous to elevation, as this bluish arrow is kind of representing the LiDAR laser as it is emitted from the sensor in space or in the air and hitting this plant, going through the leaves, through the canopy, hitting the ground, and then reflecting. And so we can see that this is the most energy kind of when it hits this bottom area. And so that could perhaps be indicative of elevation or ground height. And so I really encourage you to, if you're curious about kind of the more physics of LiDAR, which, like I said, is kind of outside the scope of the applied remote sensing side of things, check out Neon Science. They have a lot of cool materials on LiDAR and even just references on where to go next. But you don't really need to dive too deeply, just because it is a lot of just math, and we're not in a math degree. But it's also important to know that there's kind of different types of LiDAR systems, because as you're working in the field, and I say the field, I mean like your careers in the geospatial profession, and even just kind of other whatever pursuits your professional career kind of bring you. I think it's important to just be aware that it's not just a general blanket system always. And so let's dive in a little bit, no math, but just understanding that generally there's two types of LiDAR systems: full waveform LiDAR and discrete return LiDAR. When we're looking at the wavelength of that tree diagram previously, we were looking at the waveform, but not all sensors are necessarily collecting the entire returned light response. So you can think about it almost like this discrete return is taking snapshots in time every so often, whereas the full waveform LiDAR system is actually looking at the entire returned light wave. And so there's pros and cons to both. I think that's something that could also be an interesting topic maybe for a project, even like looking into pros and cons of LiDAR systems in a specific type of ecosystem, or even in like a specific use case, and where previous researchers or governments have used this to solve a problem. But yeah, we can talk about that later too. So now that we've talked a little bit about LiDAR and gotten some context for that data collection type, where it fits in the broader kind of research picture, mainly with a focus on kind of plants, let's really focus in on plants and talk about canopy height model. And so I think that you've all, or many of you, have encountered terms like digital elevation model, perhaps something like digital surface model or digital terrain model. And that's kind of the intermediate products that are used to generate a canopy height model. And so really the canopy height model is the height or distance between the ground and the top of objects above the ground. Usually this is trees, I mean, canopy height, but it could also be buildings, especially in places where it's a wildland urban interface. You could imagine a canopy height model that has not only a forest, but the kind of intermix of human structures that may exist. And so that's where this disclaimer comes into place. You should always check to make sure your data is kind of clean or pre-processed, and to just assume that it's all trees, because data collected at the wildland urban interface often will have human structures. So just something to consider if you're doing any analyses with LiDAR data. So the digital surface model is kind of measuring the height of not only the ground, but also kind of all objects on top of it. And so it might be a little challenging to see, but there's lots of little kind of brown speckles, which are indicative of the ground LiDAR laser data points. And then these kind of greenish dots are more the vegetated landscape. And so this DSM is kind of both. Whereas we're looking at the terrain model, it's just this ground height. And so we're not really looking at trees. And so if you think about the canopy height model, it's really the digital surface model minus the digital terrain model. And so we're just getting the height above ground. And so the canopy height model is used at a variety of scales, geographic scales. The Getty sensor is this global LiDAR sensor being used to create global forest cover maps, which is pretty wild. But it goes kind of everywhere between global satellite sensors all the way to a pretty expensive LiDAR drone. But there's also like airborne LiDAR systems on airplanes. And on the right here, you can see a more kind of ecosystem landscape scale LiDAR data set where they're using this point cloud to then generate this kind of canopy height model. And then they're able to animate this into this kind of Unreal Engine video game-esque forest using some other kind of visualization modeling. But it's pretty cool to see how you're able to generate data of this type across scales and really get meaningful information for researchers and communities. I've seen canopy height models used in the context of deforestation studies and measuring where kind of landscapes are being disturbed. And so I think that it's a tool that can be used not just in pure environmental research or pure, whatever pure means, but people looking at just the environmental response. I think that canopy height model is also an indicator that can be used in research or work at the intersection of people, the land, kind of geography, you know what I mean? Where it's how everything is connecting and you just need to measure how things are changing. And so canopy height model is a really powerful tool to measure how things are changing. And so that's really it for the lecture today. If you want to learn more about LiDAR, canopy height modeling, I encourage you to check out some of the links that I've included in the in the lecture, and then even some of the readings that I've included in the lab today. But that kind of concludes slides, so we can really just jump over to Collab. Let me open this in Collab, and I guess I'll share the link in chat as well. Make things convenient. Okay, sweet. So we're going to be kind of building off of what the skills we've been developing in previous weeks using Python and some command line scripting to download data, interact with data, and kind of automate analyses, because I think that's kind of a super powerful skill that even if you're not going to necessarily write Python scripts after this class, I think um, having an awareness and appreciation for what can be done, and then hopefully whetting your appetite to maybe learn a bit more. So this is an adaptation of work from the Earth Lab at UC Boulder. They have a really cool program kind of on Earth and environmental data science with Python. And so their chapter 5 goes into LiDAR and canopy height modeling. And so I've kind of condensed it all into one notebook so that we can kind of run through it, and you don't have to worry about installing anything because they don't use Collaboratory. And so I think this should be a fun exercise. And as always, you don't, to get through the main lab, you don't need to like write any of your own Python code. But this week I did introduce an optional extra credit section where you're able to kind of, if you feel so inclined, tinker. And even if you try, you'll definitely get credit. So like, just try. But just giving you some guardrails to like explore and tinker with Python. But it's really just kind of building off what we do in this lab and changing a value here and there. And so as always, I'm here as a resource this whole 4-hour session, but then throughout the week too, if you have questions or concerns, just ping me and we'll get to the bottom of it. But yeah, part 0, because we're using Collaboratory, we got to install some dependencies that don't already exist. And namely, that'll be EarthPy, which we used last week, and then Rio X-Array, which is this other powerful library. I don't know if we used it last week, but it's kind of a complement to raster.io and this interface between raster.io, which we have used, and X-Array, which is this other library that lets you handle, I guess, huge multi-band raster data across data types. So I linked all these resources that we're using kind of in the instructions. So if you want to learn more about any of the libraries, and then throughout the lab, I believe I also commented links to the functions and stuff we're using. So if you want to learn more or just read up on like what that function does, you can. So let's just install EarthPy and Rio X-Array. You might get this error, but it's fine. It's me. I mean, like in general, don't, when someone says just trust me, it's fine. Like probably don't do that, but like it's fine. Like, so we're just installing these libraries using pip, which is the Python package manager, which we've used a few weeks now. So none of this should be new. I mean, the library might be different, but this process of installing the library is totally the same. And we're done. Cool. As usual, if you want to have crabs and corgis and cats on your notebook, just go to Tools, Settings, Miscellaneous, and then you can enable the silliness. All right. So we're using data from UC Boulder Earth Data Science Lab, or Earth Data Lab, Earth Lab. And so if you like, you can manually download this, but we're going to use wget instead because that's so much faster. So wget, yeah, I've linked wget here. Okay, cool. So instead of like right clicking and saving and then having to upload to Collab, we can just download straight into Collaboratory, which is really cool. And we did this last week, pretty sure, and the week before. So you should all be pretty familiar with wget, and I hope you at least tinker with it in your personal and or professional computing endeavors. I think you can install it on Mac, Windows, Linux, so, and it's free. There's other alternatives like curl, but it's the same idea, just not having to use the user interface to download stuff. So we downloaded that file. Let's list out what's in our directory. Cool. So we have this file we downloaded and then the sample data, which is just pre-populated by Google. So we're going to use a new command now to get the data type of this file, because I'm not actually sure what it is, because it just has the name, you know what I mean? And we're not going to use DTRX today necessarily. So we are curious about what the data type is, so we can use the correct extracting utility. And so you can see it's a zip archive, which is cool. So we'll just use unzip. And so let's just run unzip to extract the zip archive. And you can see we have a bunch of stuff that was extracted. So let's use ls and see what we have. So this is our zip file, so we can kind of disregard this. We have a directory called discharge, downloads, precipitation, and spatial. And then sample data we can also disregard. So let's see what's inside discharge. So it's some CSV, an rich text file, kind of like a README data, and then another text file. So just some text data, some tabular data. If you want, you can inspect that data using Python, but that's kind of outside the scope of this lab, but that could be something if you want to tinker with on your own and learn. Same with precipitation. We just have some CSV datas and then perhaps, I guess, no, very specifically some documentation about the precipitation data. We have spatial, which is full of other folders. So we got shapefile, and then we also have some post and pre-flood directories, which might have some interesting data. And then we have some LiDAR data in .laz format. But you saw how that was kind of annoying, and it would be nice to just have a visualization kind of like this, but that was more, I guess, aesthetic and showing the hierarchy structure of the folders. And so that's where a tool called Tree comes into place, which is super nice, also free and open source, and we can use it to display the folder contents of a directory or file contents of a directory in a tree format. And so we can see we have our period, which is this current directory. We have the zip file, and then everything is kind of nested and showing the correct indentation where it exists. So that's a nice little utility. I use this when I'm working on projects I haven't necessarily created from scratch, and it's kind of a collaboration. It's just useful to visualize what's there, or even after doing an operation that generates a bunch of data files, it's nice to use Tree to see what came out. And so you can see we didn't previously look at the post-flood, pre-flood subdirectories, but we have some LiDAR inside, and these are digital surface model and digital terrain model in TIFF format. And that's what we're going to be using today. So now that we've inspected our data, let's actually generate our Canopy height model. So we're going to be using some Python dependencies that we should be familiar with by now. Let me just get a sip of water. This is the most I talk in my entire life. All right, so we're going to use the OS module to kind of declare file paths and interact with. Axel, you have a question. What's up?
Yeah, so I think your video quality is like extremely low on our end. Like we can't see the screen at all. It's
Damn.
very blurry.
All right, let me try something. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah.
I am looking. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try to share my screen instead and see if that helps. How's this? Can you all see me? Is that a little better?
Yeah, it's so much clearer.
That's
Okay.
way better.
Okay, sick. Sorry about that. I don't know why. Let me try to zoom in a little bit too, because I can see it's kind of small. Yeah, I think if it's ever like that again, let me know and I'll use this method. I'll try to remember. Oh, that's way too big. Okay. Oops. Okay. So OS module, where I left off, just kind of like declaring file paths, folder paths, manipulating files in a way that you don't have to worry about whether you're on Windows or Mac or Linux and dealing with forward or reverse or backslash. It's just OS. And then there's even other libraries you can use instead that are more modern, but for now, OS is chill. NumPy is super clutch for array mathematics. And if you think about raster data, it's just a bunch of arrays. And by array, I mean like a grid, like an image is an array of X by Y cells. And by cells, I mean pixels. All right. Next, PyPlot, which is a visualization library, kind of similar to MATLAB, but you don't have to worry about that too much. But it's super common in Python data science circles. And then Seaborn is this like next generation styling library, which takes Matplotlib, PyPlot, and allows you to make way prettier, nicer looking graphics that don't look like they're from like the early 2000s. Nothing against that. It's just you have more options, a lot easier. Next, Rio Xarray, which is this interface between raster IO and Xarray, like I previously mentioned. And then EarthPy, which is something we used last week for a lot of raster data manipulation. And then, like I alluded to about a minute ago or less, we're going to use Seaborn to enhance the styling of our plots. And so we're just going to set the theme. I mean, it's not going to be like amazing, but it simplifies the use of Matplotlib in a way that otherwise you'd have to manually configure a lot of stuff. And so Seaborn just streamlines things for you. So we're just going to set some really basic theme settings, but you can go pretty crazy and make beautiful themes with Seaborn. And so I encourage you to look into that if you're more on the aesthetic side of GIS stuff. Cool, so we are good to go. So now let's use the OS module and the path join method to read in one of our data sets. And so we have this kind of parentheses with comma separated values, and you can see that these are just the paths that were declared above here in this like tree command or even using ls. And so we're just separating each subdirectory name with a comma, and you don't have to deal with specifying forward or backslash, which can be an issue when you're working on a team with people using Windows and Mac. So this is just nice. And so we're just gonna have this path here that's used that we can use, and then we're just gonna read that data using raster IO or raster IO Xarray, Rio Xarray, and using their open raster IO method. And let's just see what happens. So we get this output. It doesn't actually show our data in the way that you might be expecting. It's just kind of showing some metadata about our data. And so showing the size of our array, kind of some attribute information, but it's kind of a little weird. It's not like the most intuitive, if I'm being honest. You can kind of like drill in on some things, but it's not like the most useful, but they give it to you. All right, so I think we're all looking more for kind of like a plot, like a two-dimensional image that we can see. And so let's use PyPlot and the subplots method to kind of generate a figure that we can then attach our data plot to. So we're just plotting our LiDAR DEM. So it might take a second to read in the data, draw, render everything. You can see it's a little smushed on my screen, but it's a DEM for Lee Hill Road before a flood. And that's some more context that I guess I forgot to give, but was kind of hinted at the file names. This data is for the 2013 flood season, I believe, in Colorado. There was some pretty extensive damage in the area, and there was a pre-flood DEM available, and then the I believe it was Neon took another DEM after the flood, and there was a lot of work kind of tallying and inventorying the damage, and so we're using this data in kind of a more learning capacity, but this was some real world data that was used to, I'm sure, assess damages and perhaps even like award payouts for insurance and stuff like that. So that's the DEM. Now let's open the digital surface model. So like the digital elevation model, it kind of gives this ugly output that's not the most useful. But let's plot it. Take a second because it's not massive, but it's a data set. So it looks pretty similar. So it's actually pretty challenging to see a difference between the digital elevation model and the digital surface model. And so this is where the Canopy height model really comes into play and helps visualize that. So let's generate or calculate a Canopy height model and then plot the results. And like we mentioned before, the formula is just digital surface model minus digital elevation model. Before we do the raster math, let's just make sure that our rasters are of the same extent and we're not trying to do like a subtraction across no data and there's like some weird either extent mismatch or even the resolution mismatch. So you can just use the Rio bounds method or the Rio resolution method to output information about data sets bounds or resolution, and then we're just doing a comparison to see if they're the same. So we're just comparing the DEM and the DSM, and it looks like they're the same resolution and bounds, so we should be good to go. So let's calculate the Canopy height model. It's really just subtraction. We're just doing LiDAR Canopy height model X-ray Rio is LiDAR DSM minus LiDAR DEM, and then we're going to plot the data. And like we mentioned before, this is before the 2013 flood season. And so now you can see a lot more clearly where there's plants and perhaps even in a less natural orientation. If you look at the more western side, this looks kind of more speckled like you might expect in nature, or it's maybe following certain natural water bodies and there's more large clusters of plants. But then here you can see this pattern, which looks like suburban America, and it's probably lots of intermixed buildings potentially, unless this data was cleansed. And so that's just something to consider.
Alex?
Yeah, what's up?
You said the raster IO. Is that happening in the back end? Because I don't see it here in the commands.
Yeah. So the Rio X-Array is this interface between raster IO and X-Array, and it kind of plugs in a way where you don't have to worry about it. And so here on the checking the bounds and the resolution,
correct,
using this .rio kind of in between it's kind of letting the program know that you're using this like raster IO kind of helper method. And so these libraries kind of overlap and intercommunicate in ways that you don't have to worry about too much.
Okay.
Until you do. Sometimes it can be annoying, but in this case, it's really like you don't have to worry about it other than it'll work. And if you want to learn more about the method, I really encourage you to look at the docs, which I linked here. But yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. But yeah, in general, it'll just kind of work where like the Python libraries are speaking and you kind of just have to invoke some kind of tool and not worry about it too much. Yeah. Cool. So let's investigate our Canopy height model. It's nice. It looks cool. Like, yeah, that seems like Canopy trees. But let's like plot a histogram and see distribution of values. Maybe get a sense of the types of canopy heights that we're seeing in our landscape. Because this will vary depending on where you are. I mean, some trees are like 300 feet tall. Other trees are like 12 feet tall. And so at this range, the distribution, like the shape will also be different depending on if there's a ton of trees of the same shape. If it's very diverse, it's really, there's no like one size fits all, but it's just like a helpful insight into what's going on. And so we can see here, most of the trees are kind of this 0 to say even under 5 meters tall. So let's actually get the minimum and maximum value for this canopy height model. So we can see 0 is the minimum and then 26, 27 meters. So like 100 feet. That's a pretty tall tree. So you can see that's a pretty broad height range. I guess 0 would be indicative of the ground. Cool. Now, oftentimes you'll want to save an intermediate data product for use elsewhere. So say you do part of your analysis in Python, but then you want to do the rest in NV, ERDAS, ArcGIS, something, QGIS, you know what I mean? You might want to output and save your data as a GeoTIFF. So we have this in-memory array right now, our CHM variable, but let's save that so that we can use it elsewhere. So again, we're going to use the OS module, the path join method, specifying our outputs subdirectory. We're just going to check to make sure it exists, and if it doesn't, we'll create it. And by that, I mean the directory, but we do know it exists. We're checking to make sure that the coordinate reference system, or we're just checking to see what it is, and then checking that there's a no data value defined, and then we're just going to save our data using the Rio2 raster method. So you can see this is kind of similar to above where we're doing Rio bounds or Rio resolution. We're kind of invoking raster IO helper utilities through this Rio X-ray module, and we're able to just save to raster in a single line. So that's pretty cool. Cool. So we can see now that we have data here. And if you want to, I guess, verify that it exists, we can use tree again. And then we'll see in the spatial outputs, we have a LiDAR CHM TIFF. Awesome. And so let's just make sure, kind of like a checking, double checking, sometimes I do paranoid sometimes just to make sure everything worked. So I created a new variable called LiDAR CHM XR test just to make sure that the GeoTIFF that we saved worked and looks like we expect it to. So let's read in this variable into memory and then plot the data to make sure everything looks good. Looks good. It looks the same. So,
Sorry to interject. Did
It's
you
all good.
insert a cell to insert the tree command?
I did, yes.
Okay. I missed that. I was looking away.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. I just inserted that kind of very briefly. So yeah, if you ever need to insert a cell, just do the plus symbol here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Cool. right? So we generated our canopy height model, but it's kind of this unclassified raster of green. You know what I mean? It's not giving us too much insight into what's going on. We know the maximum, the minimum. I guess we can get some data doing some like basic statistics, but say we have a better idea of the distribution of kind of trees and their sizes in this area, we can kind of reclassify our data and then get a better understanding of where things are located in space. And so let's use some other libraries to help us do that. And so we were using matplotlib pyplot previously. Now we're going to use another kind of submodule of matplotlib, colors, and then these will just help us make color ramps with custom colors and stuff like that. So, and if you want to look more on these utilities, I link them here. And then we're importing another submodule of EarthPy that'll help us kind of plot our data. And then we're actually going to import Xarray, not Rio Xarray, but the pure Xarray to do, I think just like one line we need it, but we'll see down below. Sometimes you need raster IO or Xarray, and like the Rio Xarray isn't enough. So it really just depends. So let's display some raster statistics about our, or some summary statistics about our raster. So this is kind of what we had above. Like it's literally the same. It's just like purple now. And it has a title. But say we have a better understanding of the bins, like I alluded to previously, let's impose kind of some forcing on the data, kind of like you might see in software like ArcGIS with like the equal breaks or like the janks, like those kind of distributions. We can also do that too with Python. So nice. I mean, it basically looks the same, but now we have fewer bins. And so you can see the data is kind of reshaped in this histogram. But say we know what the actual heights of these tree groupings are. So 0 to 2 meters, no trees. 2 meters to 7 meters, short tree. 7 to 12 meters, medium trees. And then greater than 12 meters, tall tree. We can also apply that kind of bing and see what that distribution is. And you can see that it looks really weird, but in most trees are kind of, or it's mostly bare ground in this 0 to 2 range. And then I guess most of the trees are kind of small. There's some medium. And then there's not that many, but it's a pretty broad range at the really high end, which is interesting. Okay, and so now we can map our raster values to these values. And so this is just like reclassifying a raster like you do in a traditional GIS software. You can also do this using Python scripts. And so we're going to apply that same kind of categorization of no trees, short trees, medium trees, tall trees on our raster. And so NA, no data, it's no trees. A 1 is short trees, a 2 is medium trees, and a 3 is tall trees. And so this is our new categorization that we're going to apply to this data set. And so we're assuming that there's no trees in these locations between 0 and 2 meters, which may or may not be correct. But it's just the logic we're going with today. And so if you know that may or may not work in your landscape, that's just something to consider or note in your research study. And I'm sure there's more sophisticated ways to kind of off that as well. So now let's kind of create these bins. And so we're just generating some helper variables for ourselves. So the minimum value and the maximum value of our canopy height model. And then we're setting these bins, negative infinity and positive infinity as the upper and lower limits. And then these 2, 7, and 12 meter kind of boundaries that we discussed up here. And then we're going to use the Xarray apply ufunc method to apply this np digitize function to our canopy height model, which is really kind of this reclassification utility. It's reclassifying an array. And so then we're able to plot our reclassified raster. Nice. It's not perfect, but it's looking a little more interesting. So now let's mask out those node data because we don't really care about this like yellow area. It's just not that interesting. And so then we can plot that. It's a little easier to see what's going on. But then we probably don't want to have this gradient color bar, and instead might want categories. And so we can do that using listed color map and boundary norms, and helping us display data on certain colors. And so here we're using some kind of shades of green and maroon to depict our landscape. And then we're almost there in terms of our finished visualization. And now we can add a legend to kind of make our figure very descriptive and more useful for potential readers. So you can see how not too difficult a task to classify our LiDAR-derived canopy height model and kind of generate a land cover classification for an area. I mean, there's definitely a lot of disclaimers, and this is pretty coarse and not too sophisticated logic, but this is a great starting point for further studies. And so you can see how this data set, it's pretty broad, and you might not be interested in the whole area. So you can also use Python to crop data. And so now we're going to put into cropping our raster data. And so for this, we're going to import a few more helper dependencies, Shapely and GeoPandas, which are pretty widely used in the more vector GIS side of Python. So let's use those. And then we're going to open our cropping layer. And so the cropping extent was provided in the spatial Boulderly Hill Road subdirectory. It's called clip extent. It's one of those shapefiles I discussed previously. So we're just going to use GeoPandas to read in that shapefile and then display coordinate reference information about the shapefile and our canopy height model. And you can see they're in the same coordinate reference system. That's good. So we can kind of use them together without too much pre-work. So now let's plot the shapefile extent. So it's just an ugly rectangle. But now let's display that on top of our canopy height model. So you can see it really just kind of, it's trimming off this like lip on the left. I mean, this is really just a toy example, but you can have a different extent. You know what I mean? It's really just teaching you how to crop raster by layer. And so let's actually clip our canopy height model using this vector boundary. So again, we're using the kind of Rio assessor method on an X-array data array. And this time instead of bounds or to raster, we're using the clip method. And then we're passing in the geometry of our crop extent and then our crop coordinate reference system. And we're just going to plot that data. And so you can see now we have our cropped canopy height model. We're still using the kind of lazy, not pretty legend and colors, but this is more just kind of showing you how to crop data. And then before we kind of get into the reading section, I wanted to include an extra credit portion for this lab where I guess you can build off of what we did already. And so, like I mentioned before, all of these rasters that we've calculated so far are for pre-flood. And so we calculated the pre-flood canopy height model, but there was a flood. And so I think it'd be interesting to see what happened, what was the extent of damage or lack thereof. Were certain regions more vulnerable than others? And so for extra credit, I encourage you to basically redo this lab, but with the post-flood data. And so I give you kind of some breadcrumbs on how to get started, but you use very similar commands to everything we did, and you can skip a lot. I mean, it's really just kind of visualizing or generating the canopy height model and then visualizing it. So it's not too many, it's like 2 or 3 code cells, but just make sure you're using the correct data. And so for the pre-flood, we've specified pre-flood and pre-DTM. So I encourage you, so you don't mix up your variables and get confused, create a new variable called LiDAR-DEM path post, and then specify the post-flood file location, and then duplicate all those Python commands that I ran above to kind of create the post-flood canopy height model. Because I think that'd be a good exercise for you to kind of reaffirm the Python. Everything is here. Like, you don't need to like look up any new commands. It's really just rerunning some commands on a new data set that you already have access to. And I give you some code cells here, but if you need more, just click the plus code button. And then if you want to keep going, I'm also kind of asking you, can you do a change in canopy height model? So remember how last week we did or 2 weeks ago, the change in NBR or NDVI, like you can do a delta image. And so I think it would be interesting to see the difference in canopy height after the flood event, and that you could visualize that. And again, all the kind of commands are in this notebook, so you don't need to look up anything. It's really just kind of plugging stuff in to the tools that you have. And that's really it for the Python side of things. The rest of the lab is reading 2 articles about canopy height modeling across kind of sensor platforms and geographic scales. And to kind of give you a little teaser, it's really just looking at the article where these 2 figures came from. So the global scale, and then a more kind of ecosystem landscape scale of using canopy height models as an indicator. And so I just want you to write 4 to 6 sentences kind of discussing how canopy height modeling is similar or different across sensor platforms and geographic scales. And so you're just like, it's not a summary so much as synthesizing what you learned across the 2 articles and where these techniques are similar or different depending on things like the sensor platform or the scale of the study. And then once you're done with all that, it's really a matter of submitting this lab to the repo you created during Lab 0, kind of like we did last week. And so to do that, you'll do File, Download, and then you'll download this IPYNB file, like I did here. And then you'll navigate to the repo you created in Lab 0. Everyone has a different one, so I can't like hard link one, but it's the one that you created in the first session. And then you'll just add a file and upload your file. And so that would be done kind of like this. I'll do a quick little like demo. So imagine I wanted to add a file. I would go to this add file drop down here, select upload files, and then this is where I would choose the IPYNB file that I just downloaded. And then once I select the right file, you click commit changes, and then you're good to go. And make sure you do that on your repo. And that's really it. So if you have any questions, reach out to me on Discord or email or GitHub. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But yeah, you feel free to get started and have fun. And if you have questions, just unmute. I'm going to turn off my camera, but actually I'll leave it on for a while. I'll turn it off a bit later. Yeah. Cool. But I will stop sharing my screen actually, because I don't think you need that anymore. Oh yeah, and this is due next week before class. I didn't put that in the instructions, but I'll send an email or something. But yeah. Are you all cool if I stop the recording and start uploading to YouTube? Or would you like me to keep it going in case there's a question? Just to be clear, is the thumbs up to stop or to keep the recording going?
I don't mind it stopping.
Okay, cool. Just wanted to check. Thank you.